Okay, this is a 1988 Hewlett-Packard workshop, and the students are busily scurrying off to do their case studies.
No, I mean, and all that. Check.
We're being flirty.
Where did my people go?
Good morning. Good morning. Our case study is titled the Analysis of High Temperature Superconducting Thin Films. And first I thought, or we thought, that the definition of a superconductor would be important to understand. And one definition is the passage or the allowance by the superconductor of electric current flow with virtually no resistance at a critical temperature. Another is that when a superconductor is immersed in a magnetic field, it excludes the flux line. And this demonstration here shows the superconductor, which is in a hub of liquid nitrogen, approximately 77 degrees Kelvin. Then the magnet is levitated above the superconductor because the flux lines are excluded from the magnet. This the terminology for this concept is the Meissner effect.
That's the way chemistry.
It is reproducible. That wasn't levitated. Oh!
Let's jump it out the way.
So just to put in perspective these temperatures, originally or initially, superconductivity spectrum exhibited mercury at 4 degrees Kelvin, which is the equivalent to minus 207 degrees centigrade. And research and development over 75 years or so has brought up to this rate that liquid nitrogen is 77 degrees Kelvin, or minus 196, I think, Celsius. So that's what we're talking about when we say high temperature. It's higher than it used to be. This was originally, and now it's over this rate. And a key breakthrough was to get the temperature of superconductivity above liquid nitrogen because it's much cheaper and easier to deal with liquid nitrogen. And to further show the other characteristic or the loss of resistance, we have to start here that it shows the resistance of a sample decreasing as a function of the temperature. Remember, this is actually getting colder in this way, even though the numbers are so zero resistance in this compound was achieved at approximately 90 degrees Kelvin.
One point about that straight line point, does that extrapolate to zero? No, it doesn't. On the left.
In a true
Zero is no, I know, but it is the upper part of the field where it's starting. Is that resistance directly proportional to absolute temperature?
Yes, in a given compound,
Yeah.
okay, the resistance can be quantitative as a function of temperature. Now this might be slightly idealized, and this compound has been the best performer to date. And there's what they call the onset of the critical temperature and the actual.
No, I don't think you understand my point. My answer, now that I have a chance to look at it, is no. That if you put a ruler along that upper right-hand part of the curve and plot it backwards to 0 Kelvin, it's got some resistance. Whereas a metal, as I understand it, a pure metal like copper or platinum, would give you 0 resistance at 0 degrees Kelvin.
Right, if you extrapolate.
Yeah.
Never mind.
They don't have any electrons to move on at 0 degrees Kelvin. So how does it do that?
Okay, our case study challenge was to develop instrumentation for the characterization of high temperature, superconducting thin films, which obviously these are not. Also, we wanted to develop or look for methods that would measure the performance properties of thin films, high temperature superconducting. There are several mechanisms for the manufacturing of thin films, and really don't want to delve into that at this time. And just to show when we're talking thin film, how thin, typically the film thickness of the materials in the 1 to 5 micron range, and we show here micron is 10 to minus 4 centimeters, and angstrom is even smaller. Angstrom, of course, is the level when you're doing the evaluations or characterizations or actually trying to read the material. Angstrom measurements are necessary. Applications, of course, are almost limitless in the electronic industry, where the thin films would be used, magnets for some of the instrumentation that we discussed yesterday, and an aspect of it. And so Rob and Cindy will discuss our findings and instrumentation that we chose to evaluate.
Properties for characterizing thin films. We arbitrarily took, because of the literature, we're going to look at an yttrium barium and copper oxide. So when we start talking about elemental analysis and some of the analysis we're going to do, go back and this is the compound that we're talking about. And we'll be discussing the properties of thin films and ways to characterize. Some of the measurements, we were asked to set up a chemistry lab and do the chemistry for the thin films. We're not going to be involved in the manufacture, and also some of the measurements you saw regarding resistivity or resistance versus temperature, we're not going to be doing those measurements. They'll be done by our electronics lab. They'll measure the conductivity or inverse resistivity, and also the current density, its ability to carry a current, which is important in the electronics industry. Some of the important characteristics of a thin film are the physical or the structural, some of the microstructure of the thin film, the uniformity or the topography of the thin film, and also the thickness. We need to know how thick it was, as Ken was mentioning, how many microns of a thin layer. Also, what we're most interested in is the chemical properties of the thin film. The elemental composition, some of the impurities. Why does one thin film work better than the other? Does it have some impurities that the other one doesn't? And also the uniformity, which you'll see some of the techniques we can do. Talk about a couple instruments. The one I'm going to talk about is the Auger Electronic Spectroscopy, which we went over yesterday, or AES. The instrument we're going to choose is a scanning instrument, which is the one, if you remember, we can rasp it back and forth to kind of get a profile. So we have lateral resolution. We can do this surface imaging in around 500 angstrom spatial resolution. Also, we're going to recommend the Ionbeam, which will come in on the side. If you think of it as kind of a jackhammer going through the thin film as we're bombarding electrons, so we can do a layer-by-layer analysis and do the depth profile of it. The principle behind AES is to come in with an electron beam, strike the sample, and an Auger electron will be released from the inner core. That's be related to the binding energy, so we can do an elemental analysis since they're specific for each element. So we get a good measurement of the elemental analysis. The type of instrument looks somewhat like this. Remembering it's a high vacuum system, we can bring our samples in, and we'll have a carousel in here, so we can do several techniques on that one sample. Also, we'll be able to run different techniques in some of the other reports. The type of information we'll receive from our AES or scanning Auger microscopy will be first and foremost the elemental analysis. You mentioned that we had copper and oxygen. Oxygen, from what we've read, appears to play an important role in the superconductivity properties of the elements. We want to know how much oxygen is in the compound. We can also do quantitation with AES and we'll look at some of the impurities. Using the imaging and the ion beam, we can go through the different layers and look and see if we have impurities throughout or through the different atomic layers. With the uniformity in the imaging, we can get kind of like an equivalent to an electron microscope picture. We can do a visual inspection of the thin film. And these two would go together through the layers of the ion beam.
What kind of precision can you get with this analysis? I mean, how well are you going to know have your elemental information? What kind of precision do you think that you can get?
A few percent.
And is that compared to what you need to do and understand about the differences between, say, superconducting films and non-superconducting films? Is that going to give you the kind of precision that you need to distinguish the...
It appears so. From what we've read in the literature, this appears to be the way people are going as far as looking at those straight down and doing how you know what's in it.
I think it's sort of a yes and no answer to your question because we have to have the best equipment to determine the elemental analysis composition. But there's many things and interactions like always. So this is the tool necessary to try to define it as well as possible for one aspect. But that's the key question.
Yeah.
You mean absolute percent or relative percent?
Well, both. I'm not quite sure. For example, the oxygen defect is an important parameter to know. It seems to me that you would need to know if you want absolute information on what kind of defect you would have to have much better than, say, 1 to 2% precision in each of the elements that you detect because, the changes in the oxygen content could be much smaller.
As today, we haven't been able to find any other technology or techniques that we can do better as far as the oxygen.
I think it was 1%. Yeah.
Right now, it's a big
Can I ask one question? You mentioned the quantification of impurities. Could you kind of calculation of seeing in the literature here? It shows what the detection is based on, say, the areal density of the layer. Because, well, I believe that you have enough sensitivity and kind of the ability to quantify intervariant coppers fairly readily. What I'm wondering is the level of impurities that is likely to find in those major constituents is likely to be small relative to those. And for the areal density of, a micron layers,
Yeah, he has an overhead that answers that question. What's the detection level converted to like milligrams or moles for scanning object? It's a little bit hard to read, but the middle column says grams analyzed. And the only important point to point out is those are between 10 to the minus 12 and 10 to the minus 17 grams analyzed total. In terms of what's the level in the layer, as we discussed the other day, it's a few tenths of a percent. So if you have an impurity in the top layer that's not yttrium, barium, copper, and oxygen, if it's less than tenth of a percent, then you won't see it. In terms of absolute sensitivity, you're talking, it's quite sensitive, but of course, the whole samples coming from that top surface region.
Well, what levels of impurity cause problems with the?
Well, I kind of give you the same answer if I had to answer this that I give Murray, and that is, obviously people don't know yet. And this technique will allow them to measure if in fact they produce something that looks like the bulk superconductors when they try to prepare a thin film of it. I mean, no guarantees exist that you can produce a thin film of a little piece of superconductor that they were demonstrating at the start of the lecture. You could at least quantify that you're making something that has right stoichiometry as far as characterizing defects in that film and trace amounts, part per million levels of oxygen that might in fact be responsible for the existence of the superconductivity. I think all bets are off as far as I know, otherwise people would understand superconductivity now.
I guess what I was trying to get at is what you really want here is information that tells you the relative amounts of materials, but you're not going to get necessarily an absolute elemental analysis on this on the exact precise amounts of each of the materials there. And so you want something a little bit better than a crude estimate of the relative amounts of these guys and make sure, as we said, that it's in the ballpark.
Appeared to be the most important thing they were concerned about was the stoichiometry of the yttrium, barium, copper oxide. How many oxygens? Was it 7? Was it 6.5? Was it 6 compared to the amount of copper? Some of the things that Cindy was talking about. So that was the main emphasis within the article. This is an overhead of about 3-time copy of the Xerox. What I was trying to show here was back, we do the microstructure, which is with the scanning OJ, you can go back and forward and try and pick up any spots within the thin film. If somebody says, why is this one better than the other one? Doing a visual inspection, maybe you can center in on a certain spot and then do an elemental analysis within that one spot, the lines. Cindy will now talk on another method that we recommend for our lab purpose analysis.
Well, the other technique that we're going to talk about is called X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy, X-gas or acid lithography. This also is the same schematic that Rob used when he was talking about OSHA. We have a difference being that we're going to, on our sample, we're going to use X-ray electrons. We're still going to be getting electrons out, but we're still going to have an electron analyzer. The signal that we're going to produce from that is something called photoemission or photoelectric effect. The types of information that we're going to obtain from XPS, we also can get elemental analysis, but because the scanning measure is a lot more sensitive than the XPS, we really can just use that because of confirmation. We're going to give you chemical information and then quantitative information also. Quantitative from it, but big difference in X-ray electron spectroscopy and OJ is the fact that you do get chemical information from it. Types of chemical information that we can obtain is binding energy shifts with chemical state. This allows us to formally define oxidation states. It also allows us to do oxidation states and fundamentals. To kind of show you what this means, a typical spectrum in XPS would look something like this, where you can actually see different electrons from different atoms. Like this is Sp2 from sulfur. We have a 1s electron from oxygen. So it's pretty selective to this. The other thing that it allows you to do is to gives you information about the oxidation states of different atoms or elements. This is a slide taken yesterday from a lecture. We see here that by plotting binding energy is just the amount of energy that it takes to release the electron from an 2s valence level or 1s valence level. Right here, we have the binding energy of copper is 932.4. And down here, the binding energy for copper oxide is 933.6. And although the difference in energy levels is 7.12 volts, we're able to distinguish that this is copper 2 plus, this is copper. The other thing that chemical information that you can get from something like this is called satellite information. Satellite or long-term peaks. They might actually fingerprint for all those different elements, where this is a satellite peak of copper. The other type of information we've asked to get is something like film thickness. This is something called, the type of instrumentation we're going to use is called quartz crystal microbalance. And this is going to be able to allow us to actually determine the film thickness of our titanium superconducting anode. The way this is done, we really haven't talked about techniques for actually making the superconducting down on a specific substrate. One of the ways of doing it is sputtering. So we can use a specific technique to sputter something down onto a substrate. And what we can also do is measure film thickness, is use a quartz crystal. And you put the quartz crystal in, you sputter an amount of time, or what you think is a layer, onto the quartz crystal. And then either by, I think there are two ways you can actually do this. One would be actually by differential weighing, mass over volume. Or the other way is
we read a couple things about the film.
You have to look at that. You might also have to look at just a geographic location that is close by.
But are there particular scientific ways that you can learn about lead? Is one kind of lead different in any way than another kind of lead? Once it's broken down, you don't have chips around to look at anymore. You're looking at it in the blood. So the question is, are there ways of distinguishing between airborne lead or lead from paint or lead from volcanoes or whatever?
Okay, yeah, there is a way. There are two different, shall we say, extraction techniques to get, say, lead from soil. There's one where it's a total dissolution of the soil, which looks at the entire lead content. And there's also what's known as a free lead analysis, which is not as an exhaustive extraction of the lead. And that gives you the amount of lead that is, shall we say, not chemically bound, but is free, meaning say ingested.
Don or Nancy, we're still looking for a technique. You're right, that's one approach, is the free versus bound lead. But do you run across anything else in your reading about ways of distinguishing sources of energetic elements?
There have been some studies done about air sources, water sources, food intake, that type of thing. And I think that we would have to correlate that to those types of studies about how much on the average is somebody consuming food, how much on the average is somebody consuming the water. I would say that that's not anything that we can do in this study, but other than correlate that to what has been done previously.
The one specific thing I think we're doing in our study is measuring domestic water supplies, which will be a direct measure of some type of ingestion. If you look at the Haynes report, they also correlated, or attempted to correlate to lead levels in gasoline, which basically turns into airborne transport, and it's most likely ingested by contact with the soil. But in terms of differentiating between these various sources of lead in the blood, I don't have an answer for that. Maybe that's
I think one of the students in my group. As far as where the lead came from, as far as the region, lead isotope ratio would be a good idea of exactly where the lead was actually originated at, and very, very specific as far as the
Good.
because the ratios of lead to isotopes of lead.
Because we give you geographical locations as far
Right,
as
right,
the
specific
so it's different, the leads are different for each, whether it's in the water.
The radioactive decay, the timing constants, the half-lives.
They tell the differences of where lead came from and mining came from. Excellent.
How would you determine that? What do you mean?
You can do radioactive count.
The other way?
Yeah. Right.
Ice heat MS also.
Lead in drinking water, you've got to be very careful. There's been some reports here in Boulder that pipes have been soldered with a solder that's been high in lead, and then the lead sort of seeps into the water as it stands in the tap overnight, and you're going to get very misleading analysis if you simply turn on the tap and collect some lead from the water. You'll probably find quite a lot. But if you let it run all day long, you'll find very little.
There was actually, coming in a lot of the articles were the sampling techniques as far as how you take the soils, how you take the water, how you store them, how you transport it. So that those were covered fairly well. And that was mentioned, if you take it directly out the tap, you need to be aware that they have to solve.
Where are the main sources?
The main sources.
Gasoline from lead and gasoline is a major source. In the Haynes report, over approximately a 1 decade time period, they noticed nationwide a 37% decrease in average lead levels across the large age bracket. And this was basically correlated to the reduction of lead and gasoline. So that is a major source.
Big source of paints. Many toys were actually manufactured in highly aluminum paints. This has been phased out over a number of years. Also, if there happens to be just lead in the soil, children have tremendous mouth or hand-to-mouth action. And they produce Elon curd. Oh yeah, they pull chips off. Oh yeah, I did that. Especially in the poorest families.
That's why we were taking the samples, the blood samples, and we have to be some type of information taken at that time. We learned a lot about the kids in their sample, so that we can find out that information, maybe the lead concentration you're only finding and no room to find out.
It's interesting, not just children wiser. Last week, completed some analyses on a woman who, for as long as she can remember, is her.
Of course, peer review is not always correct.
reference back to like 80% of publication.
Look out for it.
Sometimes peer review is better than okay, well, we'll take a break now. Do you have one more?
Just one point. I thought it was humorous. I didn't say too much, but I volunteered to do the job for the consultant because when they first talked about the numbers, you know what number they had for a consultant?
For 3 months.
For 3 months to 50K.
Any volunteers?
Case study number 3.
Good morning. My name is Donna Levi. I'm a district judge in the 20th Judicial Court of Boulder. We are here today to determine whether the defendant is guilty of grand theft or petty larceny. Alleges that the painting is a forgery and her client should be charged with petty theft. You should realize if this painting, the jury decides this painting is authentic, the charge would be grand larceny and penalties are very severe. Marcus McVeigh, yes, for witness. In general, a variety of microanalytical techniques can be used in the study of artwork to characterize physical and chemical components. The results will be used by you to determine if the painting is authentic. One problem inherent in dating artwork is the fact that pigments, dyes, and varnishes can interfere with the analytical techniques. Also, keep in mind that possible attempts at restoration may not have been documented. The historical and aesthetic values of artwork of this nature cannot be emphasized enough. We will recreate the testimony heard in the original trial. You will have the opportunity to ask questions after the testimony is finished. Ms. Wilhite, please begin your question.
Martha, let's go through this again. When did you first receive the alleged Raphael?
Received the painting the first of this year, 1988, from John Caribou from the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. This was after his thorough investigation of the painting from a historical perspective and from Raphael's personal painting techniques.
Okay, did he indeed determine that it was a Raphael?
Yes, he did. The style of painting and brushstrokes were found to be identical to other Raphael paintings.
So therefore you were hired only to provide analytical results and interpret those results, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Can you say without a reasonable doubt that this painting is not a forgery?
Well, from the data and analysis obtained in our laboratory and from the interpretation of the results, this painting seems to be an authentic Raphael.
Well, what evidence did you provide this court to prove that statement?
My preliminary analysis was to expose any major additions or alterations. This was done by using a microscope and applying UV radiation to the picture. All these results were negative.
Are you trying to tell this court that UV results are conclusive? Even I know that isn't so.
It seems that although UV can detect new paint and contrasting textures, it is vulnerable to surfactants supplied over the painting to wash old paintings, and usually don't have any bad connotations. And I can demonstrate this by the use of a UV light that we did bring into the courtroom. As you can see, this is just a basic oil paint. And with the naked eye, you can see the various colors with the white over top. Now if we turn off the lights and expose it to some UV, hopefully the people in the back, the jurors in the back, can possibly see some things that are not exposed to the naked eye, but are with UV light. There's some underpaintings there that fluoresce a different color than the paint. And although anybody see that? Did you see the fluorescence? Different fluorescence that was actually under the painting and probably helped the painter paint those geometric patterns. Although this was not the case with the Raphael, all the UV radiation basically came up a light blue, which basically told us that it probably was washed and some of the soap is still covering the painting, and this would basically mask any alterations underneath that.
Well, where is the conclusive evidence?
Well, to provide conclusive evidence, we had to take some samples from the painting. And as you can imagine, we can't destroy a possible historical piece of artwork. And what we do is take a few samples with a very small micro syringe and take cross-sectional samples. I can basically demonstrate that. This is actually a blow-up of just a part of the cross-sectional sample. This is with an high-powered optical microscope. And you can see the various layers. These various layers that can be basically separated and analyzed in their whole form. In other words, not getting the blue pigment from the lead white to the green verdigris. We can actually analyze each one separately at this point. And basically what we found was the first priming layer of the painting consisted of some calcium carbonate and calcium sulfate. And this was identified and characterized by X-ray fluorescence.
So, how can you tell that this was applied in the 1500s and say not the 1800s?
Basically, what we had to do is then look at some of the suspended particles in the matrix. And most of these particles were irregular shaped. And this is in contrast by later centuries, they would have been manufactured to spherical dimensions.
So, you're basing your opinion on only one pigment analysis? I think that's rather weak, okay? Do you have any other evidence for this work?
Yes, well, we actually found quite a few different pigments, and we identified them also by X-ray fluorescence. The outer layer over the primer actually consisted of a copper pigment, and on the very last layer, a pigment that consisted of some sodium, silicon, and sulfur. These were identified to be verdigris, a green pigment used in that time period, and ultramarine blue. And I can actually show you the spectra of these, where you can see basically the silicon, aluminum, and calcium components of the ultramarine. In later years, Prussian blue with a very, very large iron piece would have been found. But this ultramarine blue is very distinctive for that century's period. And with the verdigris green paint, once again, you can see the components of lead, copper, and iron.
Okay, can you explain to the benefit of the court exactly how X-ray fluorescence to identify these pigments?
Sure. Most of the pigments' major components are metals. And for metal analysis, X-ray fluorescence is routinely used. Basically have a computer-generated simulation of what an element looks like and how fluorescence would actually be obtained. Basically what happens is an element can be energized by subjecting it to various wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation. In this case, for sensitivity purposes, we use an electron beam shown here to energize those inner core electrons. What can happen at this point is the electron is basically ejected from the inner core. Okay? At that point, the outer core electrons has to fill that vacancy, okay? And it can be proved mathematically by quantum mechanics. And that
Mr. Buffet, I think that the computer-generated slide there must be from Philadelphia, from flower essence.
It's a new technique we discovered at the University of Colorado. Anyhow, this outer electron actually fills the vacancy. There's a large energy emitted in the form of X-ray. And these X-ray spectra that are actually emitted, which we showed prior, for the ultramarine blue and the verdigris, is analogous to a fingerprint and can be very, very quantitatively identified as these pigments.
Well, while you're at it, can you show us what kind of instrument you use for this technology?
Sure. This is a schematic of the electron microprobe energy dispersive X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. That's why I didn't list the name on there. I actually put that fit across the top. But basically, how we produce the X-rays, and this is pretty neat stuff, is a cathode, a tungsten cathode lamp here, which produces a beam of electrons. They're then focused with the help of some electromagnet shown here, focusing this beam so that the impinging electron beam is only about a micrometer in diameter. With the help of an optical microscope shown over here, we can distinctly focus this electron beam on the various layers of pigment that we showed you on the cross section. The fluorescence is then emitted and basically detected through an X-ray analyzer. In this case, we use an energy dispersive X-ray analyzer as opposed to a monochromator-based system because it has basically 100-fold sensitivity over a monochromator-based system. So this was the way we uniquely identified these pigments.
Thank you. Now, it seems that you're leaving something out here. Isn't it true that you actually found 2 layers of green paint that had significantly different spectra?
This is true. This is very true. As you can see, by this spectrum, there were actually 2 green layers that could only be identified by very subtle differences in the spectrum. And what I have here is first the inner layer of green, which is also a verdigris pigment. And you can see the relative ratios of the lead to the copper to the iron. In the last outer layer of green pigment, there were some subtle differences, and if I can basically overlay these spectra somewhat, you can see that some of the iron, some of the minor components such as the lead and iron are very, very subtly different.
Okay, so the pigments are dissimilar, is that correct?
Yes, they are dissimilar pigments,
Thank you very much.
but
Thank you.
that
Would the counsel for the defense like to make a closing argument?
Yes, I would, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the expert witness testimony for the prosecution. I'm not going to bore you with the details of all the equipment, but basically he did take a sample. He used some analytical techniques, and he found conflicting results. I would like to propose to you, in actuality, this painting has 2 paintings on it. One underneath, which possibly could have been done in the 15th century, but the origin is unknown, not necessarily Raphael. The top painting, however, is a forgery and was painted in later centuries. And it's a forgery of a Raphael similar to the picture that Judge showed me. I think the pigment analysis clearly proved this. Therefore, I charge you with the duty of bringing in a verdict of not guilty of grand larceny and only petty theft to my client. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have heard the testimony of the expert witness, closing argument, and counsel for the defense. Can you reach a conclusion with the evidence you have heard?
Anybody tired?
Professor Slater, the jury's on. You
Yes.
a little later.
I know we want to give a chance for the students to talk and decide if they
So the jury can take any discussion.
Right.
And we also would like to reserve the time again for conclusion round.
To jump all over this.
I didn't understand number 3 where on your case study sheet where it says it's not very difficult to strip successive layers from a page so that individual points need more reach. So how can you do that without damage?
Basically what you would do in old artwork where there are some cracks or possibly in a corner, very, very easy to just take a scalpel and remove some of those inner layers. Do it with like an ultrasonic probe also, just to get some of the powder off in different places. But usually you try to do it where the artwork has already been damaged, or where it's already been restored, so that obviously you can get a lot of copy. So, exactly, and what we did in this case is we actually took some cross-sectional samples with a microsurveying sheet so we could see different layers and apply the X-ray fluorescence to them.
From the cross-section, this is an example where we saw layers, and with a microscope, you can separate the three layers in the analysis.
You mentioned something about being washed.
Yes.
What is it? What kind of evidence, what kind of information is that giving?
The problem with washing is that it's routinely done with some old paint, and basically surfactants radiate will fluoresce under UV light. If the whole paint is washed, then it's going to fluoresce a light blue. Although I couldn't demonstrate it here, you could see that some things not seen with the naked eye do fluoresce, so that if it was washed, you can't see any adulterations. We may have been able to pick up this other green lamp because it would fluoresce differently. It had some subtle differences in the atomic structure as far as some of the trace components in that paint.
You mentioned that anytime samples are taken from a restored place of paint, would this not account for the different layers that you see and difference in pigments?
If we took it from a restored area that we did not know about, that's correct.
Was this particular laying found in the restored area?
We did not determine that. All the evidence basically was presented to you. And what we did find is that there were two dissimilar green pigments. And you heard from me in my testimony that, as far as I was concerned, it was an authentic graphite area.
Do you think it would be possible with modern technology to recreate 15th or 16th century paints with labeling and analysis?
As far as physical colors to the eye, yes. As far as in the microscopic scrutiny, no. Because of the machining process manufacturing into the pigments. And that came out in the testimony also. As far as dimensions of actual suspended particles.
Also, some of the materials used in the 15th century were very extensive, are very extensive today, and you would have to try to.
Good example of that is
I can't make a decision. You're rudely interrupted. You had mentioned that there were some subtleties in the lab between layers. Is there a technique available today that you can detect those subtle differences other than X-ray fluorescence of the lead to distinguish between
It's funny fact. Because there, in our summary, we will bring up some methods that we didn't use in our dialogue. There's absolutely a multitude of other supplemental information given by other techniques. One way, and which would be a cleverer way, which you can find more trace contaminants in this, would be something like neutron activation analysis. Where you can even pick up, these actually may be components that give it color, but there are trace contaminants from the lines that typically got these colors from it that would be picked up on neutron activation analysis. But as in our lecture, things that we were in like source, through
Did you say one sample from one spot
no, we took quite a few cross-sectional samples.
throughout the entire page?
Yes, these were the only differences in pigments. The ultramarine blue and the one verdigris matched up well to other Raphael paintings as far as the pigments he used. These were the only differences we found in all of the microswirl samples.
Would there be any possible radio gain methods like
Yes, and we could once again do lead isotope ratios, as we talked about in the preceding one. The problem with that is that it doesn't specifically tell you the exact date and time. What it can be done is compared to other Raphael pigments, and specifically say that yes, this was a pigment used or no, it wasn't. But as far as dating, lead isotope is not really a dating type analysis. It's a comparative type analysis.
Yeah, aside from chemical composition, you have particle size and degree of crystallinity. And I'm thinking of mercury sulfide, vermilion, isn't it? You try to make that in the laboratory and it comes out black. Work at it and it gets a dirty red. And these artists of the Middle Ages used vermilion and it was an absolutely beautiful red, mercury sulfide. Now, that seems to me would depend upon two factors, crystal form or amorphous versus crystalline, and particle size. Can you study those?
I would think that one method that we did not use again in the dialogue would be X-ray diffraction to see that crystal lattice. And that is a very, very good technique, which once again, although all the components possibly are similar, the way they make up the crystal lattice would be dissimilar. And once again, this is something that we were going to bring up in our summary, and it's just fine that it comes out now instead of later. But can anybody make a conclusion, basically, from the information obtained and presented?
Guilty.
Guilty of forgery. How many say guilty? 1, 2. How many say not guilty?
That's why it's
Not guilty would be not guilty of grand larceny, therefore it is a forgery.
Guilty.
It is a forgery. How many say it's a forgery? 1, 2. How many say it's not a forgery?
Authentic.
What is it conclude?
Authenticated.
Authenticated. Everybody else authenticated? Oh, okay. So, check. She inferred that from my testimony. Okay? And basically, since a lot of people aren't sure, let me just say that the next logical sequence of this is actually irradiating the whole picture with X-ray fluorescence, X-rays, and see different types of fluorescence and what would have probably happened. And in our theory, look at ours, we're pretty sure. Yeah. Somebody stole it. That the one green pigment cross-section was actually taken from this green field, and that the outer layer probably was just a touch-up. Since all the other pigments matched up well with the Raphael paintings, and it was just localized and isolated to this one area, it was probably a touch-up, and then the painting itself and so forth. Expert. Whatever, so I'm sure the professor's got plenty of questions. Yeah, why don't you just make a summary and then let this guy jump on.
I just wanted to mention some other techniques that we didn't bring up in that dialogue that actually was used. Initially, an artist will usually examine a field just to look for differences in the brush stroke. It's not a scientific observation, it's more of an artsy-related observation. But also look at it through a polarizing microscope. And you can take, again, a very small cross-section from the painting, and put it on the microscope, and move the cross-section under a polarizing microscope. And different pigments will be light and dark, and various pigments used in the painting. And that would help you possibly narrow down a region that has a different pigment from a region over here that is a different pigment. And Marty's using X-ray diffraction, but that's another uncommon use method that would show that the crystalline structure, because most materials in the darkness, except for the binding media, which is way over this. I found reference also to OJ spectroscopy for elements that are lighter in molecular weight, but the problem with OJ spectroscopy is that it's very expensive, and most museums that are studying that will not have this kind of computer. I also found a reference for GC&HPLC analysis of the binding material and the hardware. It's not routinely used and it's not clear cut, but a person that I talked to said that she would take a cross section of the painting, reacted with BF3 methanol or methyl esters of fatty acids, binding that, and look for that GC. may be able to differentiate between contrasts. In the last reference I used relates to microphotons. Is something that may be good in the future, but is still not refined enough because it's not sensitive enough for the amount of sample that we need to take. I think that's it. So if you're ready to ask questions, go ahead.
Questions are open to anybody. The point I was trying to get at, well, your presentation, you were,
I thought it was something about the monochromatic base X-ray analyzer. Sorry.
well, now the one thing I would have liked to have gotten out of, I mean, you act like forgers. The question I would like to is, was there something found in this painting that was essential to it that absolutely could not have been reproduced? I mean, suppose somebody else has an X-ray fluorescence
I
spectroscopy.
can answer your question really.
Okay.
No. I mean, if somebody went to every detail, it's really a very, very difficult way to
That's what I'm saying.
actually.
Is there anything you could find in these paintings that absolutely is not available to somebody who wanted to go to a lot of trouble to make it forgery?
Can you carbonate this arrows?
Well, that's now I was getting to that. There's never even mentioned carbon dating. That's why I was.
The carbon dating itself has a lot of interferences in regards to paintings. And
Well, the other thing is you communicate in old images.
Right. That's the problem.
That's the
Repaint
problem.
that.
Therefore, it's
But
not.
what about in the paints themselves? Is there any one of these pigments that just for some reason or other you could not reproduce?
What about your, when you were preparing this, you were talking about using the red isotope ratios on this painting and on another rapid.
Right. What you could do once again is
That's right.
right, and the lead isotope, you could make a comparison and say these are pigments used in this area of the world, and they're very, very dissimilar to other lead isotope ratios.
What if you got a new shipment of paint from GP stock now on the market from overseas, right?
And that's where it falls through. That's where it falls through.
Poor guy.
So basically, what you have to do is you can basically use a lot of different supplemental techniques and basically come up with the best answer you can, and something that's all the holes are basically closed on. And it's something that, as simplistic as this as we presented here, all the holes are.
Someone who can paint well enough to reproduce the gravity out is not likely to know how to do
And basically, that's another point. The trace contaminants used in producing some of these pigments now, and not shown on the X-ray fluorescent diagram, okay, but could be picked up with like neutron activation, little quantities of possible arsenic. Some of the other metals are very, very different to today's technology than they were when they were mined back then. And something like this is going to, put up a big light bulb and say, whoa, there's something really sketchy here. But it is not clean cut. It's not trivial.
The point I was trying to get around to is that it would be probably much easier to prove unambiguously that something was a forgery if you found something that wasn't available then, and to try to prove that it's an original by trying to figure it out. So if I was a defense attorney, based on what Mr. Weaver had said, hey, you just had somebody else who was as smart as Marcus, and he went back and analyzed old Raphael painting, knew the proper proportion of elements, and just spiked his paint in order so it would come out the same way.
And it would be difficult to do, but it could be
But
a possibility.
But the way I would get around that as an expert witness is say, well, we check this, all these different things that would appear in forgery
Right.
and are unambiguous to a forgery, but didn't find any of them.
And the reason why we didn't bring that up is basically, although after, no, not at all. After seeing the first two case studies, there's plenty of response from the crowd. There's plenty of response from the crowd. Initially, we wanted to provoke some response. And this is one of the goals of the case studies. And so we left some holes in there, and we didn't nail it down. We left it open so that we would get some response. And after seeing the first two case studies, I thought I might have made a mistake there.
What about pollen analysis? Looking at pollens that are actually locked in their hands like we did in the shroud of turn.
That sounds pretty interesting, but over a lot of the papers that we looked at, I didn't see any reference to that, but undoubtedly, if you need that little piece of information, there's interest, there's probably a way of doing it, that's for sure.
Okay, that'd be something you could find, I think that would be used to prove a forgery. Pollen? Yeah, pollen.
Seems like chemically. That's not
With
what
the
makes
materials
that's not what
today,
makes it right.
as opposed to new materials today, it's not that easy, but it is a possibility. That's the
On the other
thing.
hand, you were talking about looking for maybe trace metals, contaminants in the materials. What sort of levels, concentration levels, would they be present in the material? And is it feasible to destroy as much of the painting as you would have to get enough sample to detect it?
Sure. Basically, what we showed, they're basically the copper ions and things like that are basically the PGM level. Okay? And I would take a guess. I would take a guess that those trace contaminants that are very, very subtle differences from someone's mind centuries ago to now would probably be PGB, possibly PGT level. In regards to getting enough sample, I would certainly do it well. There is some dulling and some change as far as fading. Usually it's structurally.
What's the precision of your determination of the paints? What's spectrum in the call?
They weren't different, very, very subtle, but we ran them a multitude of times and they were off by about 30%.
More general question about the admissibility or in fact the legal aspects. In many cases, when it's required to give expert testimony, how do you think you convince somebody or convince the court or the jury that techniques you're using are acceptable?
That's a good question. And that's what I try to bring out. And in regards to looking and analyzing pigments, where some of the major components are metals. The routine standard in the industry is looking